Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas is the book that we've been going through for some time here on Blessed Man Meditations. Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. Hosts a nationally syndicated radio show, Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator. His works have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic. He wrote an article that will show up later on this channel, Lord willing, as part of the appendices, and his book is Atheism Dead, on the scientific evidence of God, particularly the fine-tuning. So today we continue part 3, What is Truth, chapter 25, The Founding Myth of Atheism, Galileo, Copernicus, and the Church. In the beginning of this book, Is Atheism Dead?, we discussed how science is leading us toward faith in God. But what if we discovered that faith in the God of the Bible itself is what has led us to science? That's liable to make some toes curl, that faith in the God of the Bible has actually led us to science. As it turns out, we have discovered that faith in the God of the Bible has led us to science. Before we explain that, however, we should look at the central and founding myth of secularism and atheism, which is the story of Galileo's battle with the church. According to the venerable narrative most of us have heard more times than we could count, Galileo's persecution by the church was the opening salvo in the war between faith and science, or between religion and reason. Sam Harris likes to throw that word reason, likes to say that he likes to infer in the little dialogues that I've heard him have. He likes to infer that people who do not put their full faith in science and science alone are not being led by reason. And so anybody who has faith in a God is, by definition, unreasonable. And people like Harris have not spent time learning from the strong scientific men of faith living today, such as John Lennox, and they don't know history. Statements like that show an ignorance of history, as we have seen and will see. But like so much else we know to be true, it is not true at all. There are numerous reasons for the popularity of this deeply misleading narrative, but in Metaxas' own lifetime, it may have been the 1973 BBC miniseries The Ascent of Man that played the greatest role in advancing it. The war between religion and science, I guess. Of course, by then, 7 years after the 1966 Time magazine cover that was the inspiration for the title of this book, the culture had already shifted from the idea of God, so the TV series was only promoting the established trend. But to see how far this narrative has been pushed in the decades since, we need only to mention that when the book version of The Ascent of Man was republished in 2011, Dawkins was chosen to write the new foreword. The idea of atheism is marching hand in hand with science and progress, and the idea of faith and religion as being anti-science had become an entirely unchallenged narrative. And the majority of secularists today will agree that religion is anti-science. So let's look at Galileo and the church. The story we have all heard is that in the early 17th century, authoritarian religious forces crushed the free-thinking scientist named Galileo, and champions of reason and science have been fighting the forces of faith and religion ever since. We've said this is not true, but as with many untruths, there's enough truth to make the story plausible. True stories are also usually more complicated than the bowdlerized fairy tale versions, which is one reason we accept the myths and legends as we sometimes do. To set the record straight, we must first say that Galileo was no enemy of the church, and far from it. He was a deeply serious Christian who saw no disparity between what the church taught or what the Bible said and what science revealed. Indeed, the very idea was unthinkable to him. Right, and if you and contemporary people like James Tour, contemporary people like Hugh Ross, John Lennox, they would say the same thing. Others too, surely. And he would be deeply upset. Galileo would be deeply upset to think that his own experiences could have led people through the centuries to think it. Like most scientists throughout history, Galileo knew that no such divide between religion and science existed nor ever could. The truth of God simply could not contradict the truth of nature which God himself had created. The truth was truth, however and whenever it manifested itself. In fact, in the late Middle Ages, the two books idea had become popular. One book was the book of the Holy Scriptures, and the other book was the book of nature. Galileo even referred to this idea specifically in his famous letter of 1615, in which he laid out his understanding of how faith and science support each other. As most of us recall, the central issue between Galileo and religious authorities was whether Earth was the center of the universe or not. The generally accepted geocentric theory held that it was, and that the sun and planets revolved around the Earth. The less popular heliocentric theory held that the Earth and planets revolved around the sun. But the heliocentric theory was nothing new. It had been popularized in the 3rd century by Aristarchus and was put forward the century before by Galileo and by Nicholas Copernicus. So, to understand Galileo's story, we must first go back to Copernicus. Copernicus was born in 1473 in Poland, which was then Royal Prussia. His father was a prosperous merchant, and so, like many higher social circles of his day, Copernicus was able to pursue such interests as he wished. In the course of his dramatically eclectic life, he was a mathematician, a medical physician, an astronomer, a governor, a diplomat, a classics scholar, and a clergyman. He was also a polyglot and a groundbreaking thinker in the field of economics. In 1517, Copernicus formulated the quantity theory of money, which is the idea that the amount of money in circulation in a given economy is directly related to the prices in the economy. In 1519, Copernicus formulated a principle that 250 years later came to be called Gresham's Law. But it was for his groundbreaking work in astronomy that Copernicus would become known. Copernicus, like Galileo, lived at a time when all truth was one. What he learned via science could never compete with the truth of the scriptures, any more than science could compete with mathematics. For Copernicus, God was the God of all truth, whether scientific, philosophical, mathematic, or theological. So, to divide faith and science as we often do today was inconceivable, and Copernicus could never have dreamt that his astronomy might be troubling to the church, which he, being a clergyman, revered. We should explain that Copernicus decided to delve into whether Earth revolved around the sun or vice versa precisely because the question had never been fully settled. Aristotle in Greece in the 4th century BC and Ptolemy in Egypt in the 2nd century AD believed Earth was at the center of the universe, but, as we've said, Aristarchus in the 3rd century believed the sun was at the center. By the time of Copernicus, Aristotle's perspectives and many things had gotten the upper hand, but there were a number of astronomical discrepancies with this view. So Copernicus wondered if the heliocentric model would help clear them up. By 1510, his astronomical observations and calculations led him to conclude that Aristarchus had gotten it right, and that indeed it was the sun at the center and not Earth. So the issue was never an issue between the Christian church and the ancient pagans of Greece and Egypt. In all things, the Catholic Church was only too happy to adopt the best of what classical antiquity had to offer, and any truth found in Aristotle and Plato was as valid as the truth in Augustine and Aquinas, for example. As we've said, by Copernicus's time, most believed Aristotle was correct. So when Copernicus's efforts caused him to contradict Aristotle, some were scandalized. Their dismay had nothing to do with what the Bible said. It was rather the idea that anyone would dare contradict Aristotle, whose ideas the Church had so thoroughly imported into its understanding of everything. So you've got a conflict between Copernicus's conclusions and Aristotle's conclusions. And there were many people who revered Aristotle, and if Copernicus was going to disagree with Aristotle, they were reluctant to agree with Copernicus. People were reluctant to agree with Copernicus. Okay. Interestingly enough, those theologians most put out by Copernicus's theory were not found in the Catholic Church, but in the Protestant Church of the Reformation leaders. The only serious Catholic opposed to this theory was a Florentine Dominican, Giovanni Maria Tolosani, and his objections were little read and mostly ignored. So the idea that the Catholic Church of Copernicus's time had theological problems with Earth's not being at the center of all things is simply untrue. Just like Galileo a century later, the popular misconception is that Copernicus's scientific discoveries contradicted what the Church taught. This narrative claims that because Copernicus's science had demoted man from being the center of the universe, the God the Church believed had put man at the center was also discredited. In other words, we who thought we were special in God's eyes had been shown by science not to be so special after all. But this too is erroneous. Nonetheless, this false version became so powerful that the Copernican revolution is today widely thought to be a signal event in science's eventual triumph over faith in the Church. It's a false version that is still getting credence today, apparently. The actual story is quite different. For one thing, there were many significant persons in the Church who were fascinated with Copernicus's discoveries and directly encouraged him in them. And because Copernicus himself had a doctorate in canon law and was a cleric, there can be no question that he was not on the other side of any supposed divide between science and the Church. He was not anti-church, apparently this is saying. So, for a number of years, Copernicus freely shared his heliocentric thinking with his friends, both inside and outside the Church, and in time it gained favor in some circles. The Vatican itself never took any official position, and most within the Church assumed the truth would eventually be revealed. That's not to say there weren't some with strong feelings against the idea, but such feelings did not fall along theological lines. It's a well-established fact of history that any challenge to a widely held theory will be controversial, no matter who is doing the challenging. Not who's doing the defending. Let's see. I'm not sure how that's supposed to read. It's a well-established fact of history that any challenge to a widely held theory will be controversial, regardless of who's challenging. The philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who wrote about this in the 17th century, and in the 20th century, the philosopher Thomas Kuhn wrote of it. So Copernicus was rightly concerned that in upsetting his particular apple cart, he would anger certain devotees of Ptolemy and Aristotle, and he declined to publish his major work on the theory until he was on his deathbed in 1543. But it has nothing to do with the idea of science contradicting church teaching. It was a simple matter of going against Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle had never given a moment's thought to whether his beliefs were according to the Hebrew Scriptures, of which he was perfectly ignorant. But by the Middle Ages, thanks largely to Thomas Aquinas, many in the Church held Aristotle in high esteem, or perhaps higher than the Bible itself. During Copernicus's lifetime, then, there was no tension between faith and science, neither on this nor any other issue. Indeed, his model struck many in ecclesiastical circles as an extraordinary solution to the persistent problems with the geocentric model. In the summer of 1533, Johann Widmanstetter, who was secretary to Pope Clement VII, explained Copernicus's model to the Pope himself, who was extremely enthused and grateful to hear it. 2 cardinals were in attendance too. And 3 years later, the Cardinal Archbishop of Capua wrote Copernicus from Rome. Some years ago, this is the Cardinal Archbishop of Capua writing to Copernicus. The bishop says, quote, "Some years ago, word reached me concerning your proficiency, of which everybody constantly spoke. At that time, I began to have a very high regard for you, for I had learned that you had not merely mastered the discoveries of the ancient astronomers uncommonly well, but had also formulated a new cosmology. In it, you maintain that the earth moves, that the sun occupies the lowest and thus the central place in the universe. Therefore, with the utmost earnestness, I entreat you, most learned sir," Cardinal Archbishop of Capua says to Copernicus, "I entreat you, most learned sir, unless I inconvenience you, to communicate this discovery of yours to scholars, and at the earliest possible moment to send me your writings on the sphere of the universe, together with the tables and whatever else you have that is relevant on the subject." So the highest figures in the church were not bothered by Copernicus's theory, but as we mentioned, many Protestants took strong exception to it. For example, a certain polemical Dutchman named Wilhelm Napius penned a scathing comedy in which Copernicus was lampooned as a foolish sage, morosipus, an aloof ninny who dabbled in astrology. More serious theological figures weighed in too. Martin Luther's right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, wrote, quote, "Some people believe that it is excellent and correct to work out a thing as absurd as did that Polish astronomer who moves the earth and stops the sun, rather. Indeed, wise rulers should have curbed such light-mindedness." And John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis, said, quote, we indeed are not ignorant that the circuit of the heavens is finite, and that the earth, like a globe, is placed in the center," end quote, by Calvin. In his commentary on Psalm 93:1, Calvin wrote, quote, Calvin, the heavens revolve daily, and immense as is their fabric and inconceivable the rapidity of the revolutions, we experience no concussion. How could the earth hang suspended in the air were it not upheld by God's hand? By what means could it maintain itself unmoved while the heavens above are in constant rapid motion? Did not its divine maker fix and establish it, end quote. Of course, this was precisely the sort of thing that Augustine, 11 centuries earlier, had foreseen as a potential trap for overzealous and intellectually sloppy Christians, in which Galileo would quote in his famous letter many years later, when things on the subject at last came to a head, as we shall see. After the death of Copernicus, there was no particular movement in any direction. The great Johannes Kepler was convinced Copernicus was correct and stuck by him, but Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe and others were bothered by Copernicus' system because it did not accord with Aristotle. Brahe came up with the heliocentric theory, in which the moon and sun circled around the earth, but all the other planets revolved around the sun. At the age of 20, Brahe lost much of his nose in a duel in the dark over who was the superior mathematician with his third cousin, Manderup Parsberg, and for the rest of his life he wore a prosthetic brass nose affixed with paste. It's an interesting anecdote. On special occasions, he wore a silver or gold prosthetic. So when Galileo Galilei entered the picture, there was no established thinking on this question, and certainly no strong and united animus against it. Though the preponderance of opinion still remained with Aristotle and Ptolemy, enough had embraced Copernicus' theory to make the question far from settled. Copernicus was, of course, proven correct in foreseeing a great hue and cry from certain quarters if the issue was pressed openly, which was why the publication of his definitive work on the subject coincided with his own exit from the planet and managed to kick the troubling can down the road for others. So it was not until the first years of the next century, when Galileo discovered the newly invented telescope, that the story continues. He earnestly believed that the wonders he saw through this device were so overwhelming that others looking through it could not fail to be convinced of what he saw. It was in this spirit that Galileo stooped down to pick up the aforementioned can, and the troubles began. Galileo was a polymath and a genius in many fields, including optics. No sooner had the telescope been invented than he set out about improving it. And in 1609, the heavens were opened, both to him and to anyone else who wished to see. But as we shall ourselves see, not everyone wished to see. Nonetheless, Galileo continued making more powerful telescopes and marveled at what he saw that had never before been seen by anyone. He saw the rings of Saturn and the moons around Jupiter, naming some of them for his Medici patrons. And he saw our own moon with such clarity that he observed vast and deep craters on its surface and tall mountains too. Being a gifted artist too, Galileo made a number of watercolors of what he observed. He must have known that the news of the moon's irregular surface would vex Aristotelians across Europe, because Aristotle firmly held that the moon's surface must be perfectly smooth. So even in this simplest of all observations, Galileo was thought to be challenging Aristotle, and indirectly the infinity of the Aristotelian ideas woven inextricably into the scholastic system. Because of Aristotle, and having nothing to do with anything in the Bible, all planetary orbits were thought to be perfect circles, and all heavenly objects to be perfect spheres. But the moon had come to be even more than merely perfectly smooth and spherical. By Galileo's time, it had come to represent purity and perfection itself, and was even symbolic of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But now this troublemaker Galileo had showed that it was not a perfect sphere at all, nor was its face pristine. Rather, it was badly pockmarked, as though ravaged by scrofula or the pox. For many at the time, it was as though Galileo had, via sorcery, transformed the opalescent face of the Virgin into some craggy-faced hag, or even a senescent and syphilitic whore. Would no one defend her honor against these telescopic insults? The Aristotelians in the universities were not about to take this lying down, and they began to plot how they might repay this sky-gazing upstart from his insulting effrontery. We may recall that a central issue for the Vatican in its dealings with Martin Luther had been his bold contempt for Aristotle. So, in response to Luther's churlishness, they had, in the century before Galileo, reaffirmed their devotion to Aristotle, who in their minds had by now swelled to the value of a dozen popes. Many die-hard Aristotelians even refused Galileo's invitations to look through the magical device for themselves, deeming it unnatural to use this tube in looking at the heavens, as if the damning evidence of their own eyes would implicate them in Galileo's grave crimes. Kepler had stood firmly by the Copernican model, and in a letter to him Galileo wrote, "What would you say of the learned here, who, replete with the pertinacity of the asp, have steadfastly refused to cast a glance through the telescope? What shall we make of all this? Shall we laugh or shall we cry?" One of these obstinate professors taught with Galileo at Pisa and Padua. Shortly after refusing Galileo's invitation to squint through the telescope, this aged man passed away, at which Galileo quipped that he hoped this man who had declined to look at the heavenly bodies while on earth may now take the opportunity to do so while traveling to heaven. In 1611, the knives against Galileo were being sharpened, and his Florentine friend Lodovico Cigoli wrote to inform him that ill-disposed men, envious of your virtue and merits, met to discuss any means by which they could damage you. But all remained quiet until the end of 1633. That's when the Medici family, Grand Duke Cosimo II and Grand Duchess Christina, who were Galileo's patrons during this period, invited a former student of Galileo's to dine with them, as well as a professor of philosophy from the University of Pisa named Cosimo Boscaglia. When Galileo came up for discussion, Boscaglia seized the opportunity to pour poison into the Duchess's ear, whispering to her that what troubled him about Galileo's ideas was their contradiction of the Holy Scriptures. This mortified the Grand Duchess, whose faith was deeply important to her and who raised the subject with others. Her concerns were assuaged somewhat by Galileo's former student, who leapt to his defense. Nonetheless, when the scene was related to Galileo, he was furious. After all, it was his esteemed patrons who had heard this vile calumny. So he set about writing his now classic letter to the Grand Duchess, in which he lay out his thinking on the proper relationship between science and matters of theology. It is extremely clear from this letter, which runs to the length of a treatise, which it indeed became in a subsequent draft that Galileo took the scriptures very seriously. In the letter, Galileo quotes a passage from St. Augustine. And here is the quote from, here's the letter from Galileo to Madame Christina, the Duchess of Tuscany. In points that are obscure or far from clear, if we should read anything in the Bible that may allow of several constructions consistently with the faith to be taught, let us not commit ourselves to any one of them with such precipitous obstinacy that when perhaps the truth is more diligently searched into, this may fall to the ground, and we with it. Then we would indeed be seen to have contended not for the sense of divine Scripture, but for our own ideas, by wanting something of ours to be the sense of Scripture when we should rather want the meaning of Scripture to be ours. End quote. Galileo understood that for anyone, much less the Church, to force the Bible to appear to say anything it did not clearly say was to do great injury to it, and to the faith of those who would one day see the contradiction revealed, whether via scientific inquiry or otherwise. And of course it would be an affront to God himself. Later in the letter, Galileo expanded on his views. Quote, I think in the first place that it's very pious to say and prudent to affirm that the Holy Bible can never speak untruth whenever its true meaning is understood. But I believe nobody will deny that it's often very abstruse and may say things which are quite different from what its bare words signify. Hence, in expounding the Bible, if one were always to confine oneself to the unadorned grammatical meaning, one might fall into error. Not only contradictions and propositions far from true might thus be made to appear in the Bible, but even grave heresies and follies. End quote. In order for us to understand the exegetical twisting some did to support their Aristotelian views, we quote that verse most used to support the geocentric theory. Psalm 104:4 declares that God set the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved. To insist this be taken literally is absurd, especially since the psalm immediately continues in what is manifestly figurative language. Quote, he makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind, end quote. Very figurative. No one ever believed such verses were meant literally. But to shore up their Aristotelian views, the previous verse about the earth sitting on a foundation from which it can never be moved was taken literally, and those who took it literally could never be moved from their position. The story of how secular academics manipulated figures in the church to press their overwhelming advantage and ultimately force Galileo to recant his views is a deeply shameful episode. But, as Giorgio di Sant'Elena magnificently explains in his book, The Crime of Galileo, it is in no way the story of a battle between a secular scientist and the Christian faith. And the notion that the Vatican figures guilty of this episode can or should stand in for all persons of faith or even for the Christian faith is mistaken on several levels, as is the idea that Galileo could be squeezed to conform to the modern caricature of a free-thinking scientist battling the church. As further proof that there was nothing inherently troubling to the church about the geocentric theory, we recall that no efforts were made against it for a century after Copernicus shared it, and 70 years after he published the opus providing the full details. So when secularists recast this story, first asserting that the Copernican revolution proved via science that we humans are insignificant, so that we were not created by a loving God, but only arose in this planet by accident, they're actually casting Copernicus in their own image, as they do Galileo after him. We now know that Copernicus was bucking theories put forth by Ptolemy and Aristotle, neither of whom were Christians, nor ever even read the Hebrew Bible. In a way, the powerful figures who opposed Galileo, whether secular or clerical, were the members of a ruling elite, with great powers at their disposal and with no real fidelity to anything beyond their own power. It is not surprising, but it is at least ironic that in this way Galileo's persecutor resembled today's secular scientific establishment, which inveighs against and perspires over anything challenging the theories they cling to, often as prematurely as some attacked the geocentric model in Galileo's time, forgetting that their first fealty must be to the evidence and to the science itself, wherever it leads, and not to the paradigm that will guarantee them funding and tenure. Now we're going to look at the Copernican revolution. As we may see from the profound Christian faith of Copernicus and Galileo, as well as Kepler between them, both the idea that science during this period was advanced by those of secular bent and against the will of men of faith is secular fantasy. Yes, science got its origin because of the Christian faith. Newton, too, whose theories finally vindicated what Copernicus began and Galileo furthered, was himself a man of deep Christian faith. For all these geniuses, the scientific exploration of the natural world was a way to glorify the God who had made it, and in whose service they knew themselves to be working. So it is a profound disservice and injustice to all of them, and to history and science too, to insist that they play these ill-suited roles in our contemporary drama. Furthermore, the recent secular idea that the Copernican model of the universe was a blow to the church is simply mistaken. For example, the historian John Herman Randall insists that the Copernican view of things swept man out of his proud position as the central figure and end of the universe and made him a tiny speck on a third-rate planet involving about a tenth-rate sun drifting in an endless cosmic ocean, end quote. This is a willful misrepresentation of history and science both, as it was men of faith who advanced these theories, and in so doing showed that there were more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of than are dreamt of in Aristotle's philosophy. Those familiar with the fine-tuning argument discussed earlier in this book must know that where we are physically in the universe is especially irrelevant when compared to the infinite value God has evidently bestowed upon us by creating the vast infinity of the cosmos for what appears to be for our sake, so that we could be the jewel of infinite price mounted in the setting that is all else in the impossibly vast creation. So if those enamored of man's Copernican fall into the periphery of the universe wish to take their lead from science reckoning man's value, they must now see that value to be higher than can plausibly be reckoned. One hopes that anyone courageous enough to accept this reevaluation might also take a less dim view of the one who has given us such value. All right, that's the end of chapter 25. Next time, we will look at chapter 26. That it is the Christian faith that gave rise to modern science. So, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.